I'm Diane Lowther, and I'm speaking to you this evening from Stratford-upon-Avon in England. So this is where Shakespeare was born. And I live, I think it takes me half an hour to walk to Shakespeare's house. And I really like that because I'm a huge fan of the theatre and especially of Shakespeare. So I've been doing NLP since 1992. We've probably got some people watching this who weren't born then, haven't we? So yes, one of the great things about NLP is it never gets dull. You know, it doesn't matter how much you learn, there's always more that you can discover about how you can use NLP in different contexts and for different purposes. But I have to say that the last 4 months has been a little unusual. You see, one of the downsides of being a great NLPer is that you start to think that you're bulletproof, that whatever life throws at you, you have a strategy for handling it. And then 4 months ago, we got locked down in the UK. It's just don't leave the house, don't go anywhere, don't see anybody, just stay home. And I live on my own and I work from home, so I'm used to being at home and working on my own, but not for 4 months. And it took me about 3 weeks to realize, actually, I don't have a strategy for this. I don't know how to deal with it. So I spent a bit of time thinking about, well, you know, what's the best way to deal with being locked down at home and not being able to go out and visit my friends, not being able to visit my clients, except through the medium of Zoom or something like that. And the concern I had for my mum and all that sort of stuff. I just didn't have a strategy. So I spent some time thinking about it. And one of the things that I came back to, which I thought I would share with you today, is not strictly speaking NLP. It's actually a bit of neuroscience. And it's called the SCARF model. SCARF, like the thing you put around your neck. And it was developed by a neuroscientist called David Rock. And I came across this a few years ago. I was just looking for some recent developments in neuroscience. And what this model focuses on are the social concerns that drive people's behaviour. Now, if I tell you that there are 5 of them and they spell scarf, that won't come as any surprise. So the 5 social concerns that drive behaviour are status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. I will come back to that again if anybody wanted to scribble it down. Now, if you'd gone on a seminar and someone had said to you, these are the things that drive people's behaviour, status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, you probably would have said, okay, that sounds reasonable. I can relate to that because it fits with our everyday experience. The thing I love about what David Rock has done is that he's gone into what's actually going on in your brain so that he can kind of prove that these things are important rather than us just working on the basis of experience. And so the neuroscience of this all starts with what is known as the primary organizing principle of the brain, which is this. Your brain scans the environment 5 times every second for any sources of either reward or threat. And any sources of reward will trigger a movement towards, so a motivation towards, and anything that looks like a source of threat will trigger a motivation away from. Now, this is really important because it's not just a mental thing. It's not just something that's going on in your brain. It's actually affecting your whole physiology. So I'm not going to go into all of the details of that because I'm not an expert in that arena. But what I can tell you is that these triggers will spark off the release of various different hormones that actually affect what's going on in your body in the same way as a physical threat would. So this response is related to the kind of reactions we would have had, or our primitive ancestors would have had, you know, when we lived a very different lifestyle, and we might have been some other creature's lunch. And so, you know, when you see a predator in the distance, you get a visceral response. Well, this is the same kind of thing, that when we perceive some kind of threat, it affects the whole body. So this is why, if you're suddenly in a situation that you don't recognize, where you don't have any certainty, you're not sure whether or not you have any control over what's going on and so on, you might be triggered into a state of threat. So the consequence of these things is quite interesting. So if your mind and body goes into a state of threat, it affects certain processes really significantly. So for starters, if you're in a state of threat, your working memory gets reduced. Now, some of you might have had this experience when you've been stressed about something, that you find it harder to retain information. And that, of course, can become a stressor in itself. When you're in a state of threat, your field of vision actively narrows. So it means you cannot see the big picture the same way as you would in a normal state. And when that happens, so your working memory is reduced and your field of vision is narrowed, then you get a kind of generalized feeling of discomfort. Sometimes people call this gloom and doom, where it just feels as though nothing's going to go right for you. So, in other words, you become more pessimistic, and that can become a kind of downward spiral. Now, if you think about that in terms of the 5 elements of the SCARF model and in relation to lockdown, so status. So when many of us were told to stay home, some people lost their jobs. Some of us were lucky enough to keep a job, but some people lost their jobs. And so that immediately makes you feel like you're less important in relation to other people. The certainty piece is about being able to predict the future. Well, suddenly, nothing that we thought was going to happen next week or the week after, or even the month after, could be certain anymore. And so for a lot of people, that triggered a feeling of uncertainty. So that's 2 things now that have put us in a threat mode. Autonomy, which is about a sense of control over the events. And suddenly we have to listen to what the government's saying, what the World Health Organization's saying, and they're all saying to us, you've got to stay home. We don't have any choice in this. So that's another piece of the rug that's being pulled out. Relatedness, our sense of safety with other people. Now, normally, we feel safe amongst our family and friends, with our clients, with our colleagues, and so on. But one of the things that's happened as a result of this pandemic is that in a very subtle way, we've all begun to regard each other as a potential source of threat. In that, we don't know who might be carrying the virus and who might infect us. And I don't know about you, but I've noticed this sometimes. If I just go out for a walk, that sometimes people not only stay distant from you, they also turn their head away as you walk past. Whereas in the past, people might have made eye contact and said hello. A lot of people are just turning away. They won't even look at you. So does that make us feel safe with other people? Not at all. Right? So there's another one. That's 4 out of 5 now. And the 5th element of the SCARF model is the perception of fair exchange between people. This is the fairness piece. And I don't think many people are kind of saying, well, this is completely fair. Many people have accepted it, but lots of people are saying, this feels really unfair, that I had plans to do certain things and now I can't carry them out through no fault of my own. And they do feel just a little bit like they're the victim of circumstances. So there's 5 out of 5 elements of the SCARF model, and they're all potentially putting us in a state of threat. Now, let's look at the other side of the coin. If your brain goes into a reward state, the consequence of that is that you have much greater access to all of your cognitive resources. You have more insights, you're more creative, you're able to make connections between disparate things. You'll make fewer perceptual errors, so you will be concentrating, you will be able to take in what's being said to you and anything that's going on around you, and you literally have a wider field of view. So it's very easy, isn't it? If I asked you which state would you rather be in, a state of threat or a state of reward, we can all put our hands up and go, I want to be in the reward state. So I started to think about this. So in lockdown, how can we create a state of reward for our brains so that we have access to all of our cognitive resources, so that we can be creative, so that we can feel confident in ourselves, and so that we can see the bigger picture? Because I think if we can keep ourselves in a reward mode, then we stand a much better chance of coming out of this strange period in our world's history somehow better off. Maybe on an individual level, maybe on a community level, hopefully on a completely global level, we will be able to move forward in a much more positive way. So I started thinking about this, and I'm sure this will trigger some ideas of your own. So in terms of status, how can you, during lockdown, for me, I live on my own, I work on my own, how can I give myself a sense of relative importance to other people? And I decided actually the main thing I can do is just to look after my own needs. If I spend too much time worrying about how everybody else is and phoning up all my friends and family and saying, how are you doing? Yes, I may feel good about myself for doing that. But if I don't also look after myself, then the danger is that my brain will trip out of the reward mode and into threat mode, because I'll begin to feel like I'm not very important. So this is a bit of a recurring theme, isn't it? We need to take responsibility for our own experience. And by looking after your own needs, whether that means, you treat yourself to an early night and you go to bed with a good book, or whether you decide that you're going to make your favorite food, or whatever it is that makes you feel good and makes you feel like you're taking care of yourself, it's really important to be doing that at the moment. So that's the first thing. That's status, your sense of importance. The second thing then is certainty. Well, certainty is in pretty short supply in the terms of the big picture at the moment. But what you can do is you can create your own certainty. Now, some people do this by having a routine, and that's a really successful approach for many people. I have to confess, I'm not really a routine sort of person. And if I decide to do a certain thing in a certain way, I maybe do it for 3 or 4 days, and then something in me wants to do something else. So having a routine isn't always the best thing for me. So what I like to do is I make dates with myself. So I decide that I'm going to do a certain thing on a certain day, and I put it in my calendar. And sometimes it might be something related to work. Sometimes I'll say, because at the moment I'm working on a new book, sometimes I'll say, okay, so on Thursday afternoon, I'm going to spend the whole afternoon working on my book. I'm going to switch the phone off, I'm going to ignore my email, and I'm going to devote that time. So that gives me a sense of certainty, but I like the idea of making a date with myself to do things outside of work as well. So sometimes I make a date with myself that I'm going to watch a movie, or I'm going to set aside an hour to phone my best friend. And yes, it does take us an hour to chat on the phone. But those sorts of things give me some certainty. They give me a sense of control, which of course feeds into the next piece, the autonomy. And autonomy is about having a sense that you have control over events. Now, we don't have total control over everything, but there are always some things we have control over. And if you go back to my absolute favorite NLP pattern, which is the well-formed outcome pattern, part of that is about focusing your attention on the things that are under your control. And if we put our attention there, then we can achieve extraordinary things compared to what happens if we put our attention on the things we have no control over. So most of you listening to this are already NLPers. So I would recommend that you start thinking in terms of well-formed outcomes and focus on the things that are under your control, because that gives you that sense of autonomy and helps to keep your brain in the reward mode. So the fourth thing then is relatedness. It's about your sense of safety with other people. Now, I hope that there are lots of people that you feel safe with, that you're still able to interact with, even if you can't get in the same room as them. When I go out for a walk, or I'm in the supermarket or something, one of the things that I find makes a difference is if I take the initiative. So I don't wait for people to walk past me and look away. What I do is I take the initiative and I smile and I say hello to people. And quite often, in fact, more often than not, people will smile and say hello back. And that, I think, makes everybody feel just a little bit safer. That, yes, okay, so somebody in the supermarket might be carrying the virus. We don't know that, but let's still be nice to each other. Let's still feel that we're all in this together and that we are safe with each other on some level. I think that's really important. Take the initiative so that you're making it safe for other people to relate to you. And then finally, how do we get a sense of fairness in lockdown? I know people are listening from lots of different places in the world, and the way that this current situation has affected people has varied widely. There are people who have been told they have no job anymore. They just have to stay home and they can't work. There are people who run their own businesses who have been able to carry on working because they can do it remotely. There are people who are key workers, who are still working, who are keeping everything running and looking after other people, making sure that we're all fed and so on. For them, the working routine is different, but they are still working. And there are people who have been given financial support by their governments and people who haven't. And whatever is going on, it's easy to look at somebody else and think that they have it easier than you do. One of the companies that one of my colleagues has been working with lately, they furloughed a lot of their staff. So there was a government scheme that allowed them to tell people to stay home and not work, but they still got paid 80% of their salary, which is a very generous thing. And one company in the early stages, they put half of their staff on furlough and the other half continued to come to work. And my colleague tells me that early on, the people who were still working were saying, this isn't really fair because some of our colleagues are staying at home and getting paid and not having to work. But as time has gone on, that's changed. And the people now who are sitting at home are saying, this isn't really fair because our colleagues are actually able to work and they're doing interesting things and they're learning and we're sitting at home being bored. And so the perception of what's fair has changed over time. Now, I think with all our NLP skills, it's very easy to reframe this and come to a point where we do feel that it's fair. One of my sayings is always that fair doesn't necessarily mean equal. That, you know, if you're dividing a cake between the family, you might say, okay, so there's 5 of us, so let's cut the cake into 5. But you know, if somebody doesn't have much of an appetite or somebody else doesn't really like chocolate cake, or, you know, is it really the fairest thing to give everybody the same sized piece? You know, so sometimes, to be fair, you might just want to cut it up into slightly different sized pieces. And so it is with the experience that we're all having in the global pandemic, is sometimes you just need to stop and ask yourself, if it feels a little bit unfair, is there a different way of looking at this? If I put myself in somebody else's shoes, does it make me feel a bit differently about it? So in NLP terms, if I do second or third position, do I get a different perspective on it? Can I reframe this in some way so that I can just feel differently about it, think differently about it, use different words to describe it? Because I think ultimately what's happening here is we are all in a situation that is not of our choosing. None of us at the beginning of 2020 said to ourselves, oh, I do hope there's a global pandemic so that I can be completely broken out of all my routine and spend 4 months not working. None of us said that to ourselves. And yet here we are. But the thing we have choice about is how we respond to that. And I think if you are mindful of what's going on inside your mind, and you think about the ways that you can keep your brain in that reward mode, then you stand a really good chance of getting to the end of 2020 and saying to yourself, well, it wasn't the year I expected, but I feel like I made good use of that time. I feel like I've come out of this as a different person, a better person. And I hope that we're all going to be able to move forward into a world that has benefited from this rather shocking experience that we've all been through.